Welcome to today's session on sustainability at scale. My name is Mia Perry and I'm chairing an event titled Sustainability at Scale, the Role of Social Science Research in Building Long-Term Solutions. This forms part of the Aspect annual event series running across September and October. So I'd like to start by briefly introducing our panel. My name is Mia Perry and I'm joined by Jude Robinson, Jill Robbie and John Shee. And we will each give a little bit more of an introduction to ourselves at the beginning of our session. We're going to speak with you for about 30 to 40 minutes, followed by about 20 minutes for questions. So please feel free to begin to note your questions in the Q&A function, and we will hopefully keep to time. I'm going to start with a brief introduction to our overall session, and then we'll move through the panel at about 8 to 10 minutes each. So as I mentioned, our title is Sustainability at Scale. And so we're really looking today at the role of social sciences in building long-term solutions in relation to other disciplines and other sectors. So we understand the life sciences and engineering, for example, as really important components of sustainability work. For example, developing physical or technical solutions. We also work closely with people who work in the humanities with a recognition of the importance of cultural solutions, of philosophical and historical perspectives to enable us to evolve discourses and understandings. And the social sciences, as many of you I'm sure know, are deeply rooted in the sociocultural, the social and the socio-ecological dimensions. And in our case, specifically through public health, through education, through governance, and through socio-ecological approaches. So we not only bring essential contextual insights and information, but we can also look at sustainable issues and problems and practices in their interconnected levels across scale. So that's really what we want to focus on today. So from the micro, which is everyday practices, everyday tech, everyday behavior, to the macro, which involves the systems and the policies and the governance. And we believe that we need to, and that we can, better understand and engage with those relationships between the micro and the macro, between the what and the way we do day-to-day practices. For example, the disposable coffee mug, or the mobile phone, or the literacy curriculum, these micro practices. Between those and between the macro, the what and the why of the systems and the governance structures that promote and allow certain discourses and allow certain practices, and disallow or make less accessible other systems and practices. And we think that there's great potential with the social sciences to look across those levels and ultimately to have a better prospect for sustainability. So with that, I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Professor Jude Robinson.
Hello everyone, so I'm Jude Robinson, University of Glasgow, and I'm a social anthropologist researching health and illness. And one of my interests in working collaboratively with colleagues is around research methods. So one of my colleagues, Nai-Ray Chong, is involved in an evaluability assessment. So we're looking at evaluation at scale. And evaluation is very important for a number of reasons. So firstly, many organisations who introduce new initiatives want to build the evidence base, very important for thinking about how you demonstrate value and impact, and also how you can either retain or obtain funding for initiatives. So if something works, we need to know how it works, but also will it work in other contexts as well. But the danger with evaluation is that they can often be ad hoc, even retrospective. And without a common method, which makes them very idiosyncratic, it can produce evidence in isolation. And that can tend to diversify rather than consolidate knowledge of what works in a particular area. So the evaluability assessment, EA, is a systematic approach to planning evaluation projects, and it involves researchers working with stakeholders from industry, organisations, to clarify intervention goals, how they're expected to be achieved, and the development and evaluation of a theory of change. So this means that there can be a provision of advice on whether an evaluation can be carried out at a reasonable cost, or if further development work on the intervention is necessary. So this offers real opportunities to grow, to scale the evidence base while remaining sensitive to local context. And it's a critical part of this ongoing work. So there are a number of partners involved in this work, which is my next slide. And it shows that the partners include the Scottish Government, NHS Scotland and Sustrans. And the various topics that are being discussed include One Health, disease control, and also the retrofitting of Scottish tenements to contribute to carbon reduction targets. And importantly for Aspect, the project has been awarded a place on the Success Programme, which is a first of its kind incubator programme designed to help social scientists with innovative and marketable research ideas. I'm now going to talk about participatory methods, which is a particular interest of mine. And it considers a different issue perhaps for social sciences, rather crudely summarised for social scientists such as myself, who use mainly qualitative, more participatory methods that involve working with communities, often over time and in different contexts. But the challenge for scale is often, as I say, very crudely put as numbers and reach. So often we find ourselves working with only a small number of partners, and that can limit the reach of our findings. So we often can't talk beyond the smaller numbers that we're working with. And that has implications. So we talk about the resonance of our findings, but it's very difficult to talk about their replicability in other settings. And also we can't talk about them as being representative any way. And in qualitative social science even, in social science more generally, surveys are often preferred because they offer a rapid consultation with people. But they do tend to rely on closed questions, and this enables a more rapid analysis. But the critique is that the questions therefore are predetermined, they're closed, so may miss the mark, as people may find themselves unable to express ideas in their own ways, use local idiom, or describe their experiences, and in this way contribute to solutions. I mean, we have so many pressing challenges in society. We're increasingly aware of the need to ask people what their experiences are, what they know, and what they believe the solution should be. The other difficulty is with qualitative research, however, is that when we open up and start asking people what they think, as I've said before, the scale can close, and the difficulty of including even open questions in surveys is that if you have a relatively unskilled analysis, that more open discursive material can be lost. So participatory methods do tend to be avoided for many forms of rapid research, as data might be seen as complex or messy. It doesn't lend itself to rapid analysis through analytical formulae, and it can be very time consuming and therefore costly to collect. So I'm part of the COSTAR project, and it's a project set up to look at mental health needs of people living in refugee communities in Uganda and Rwanda. And one of the things we wanted to do to develop our data collection instrument, which we hope will be applicable across wider refugee contexts, it's a modified community behavioural adaptation survey, was to make sure that we included the local context and local idiom. So we selected, as part of our development materials, a survey instrument called DIME, which is a very inductive approach, but it asks people essentially to free list the items on a scale of what's important to them. So it is inductive in the sense that it asks people what they value, what they believe they need, but it's a very rapid form of assessment, and you just get words or phrases. So what we decided to do was to adapt the data collection instrument to include a more inductive approach. So this included the addition of a few open questions that we designed to be followed up by prompts and probes from the researcher. So the questions were informed from development theory around the work of Amartya Sen, the idea of a good life, and but by just asking a few gentle questions at the end of the free listing, we found that we provided the project with some richer, more reflective data that greatly enhanced the understandings of the other issues that came through the free listing, while adding minimal data collection time to the study. So in terms of a survey, it added richness and depth in a way that we believe just open questions in an ad hoc way don't often do. But also, it's from a qualitative point of view, it added richer data, but allowed us to rapidly move within the population. And we believe that the intangible benefit really was to let people speak. Rather than simply, if you like, to extract data. We allowed people to talk for longer or slower. It took them a little bit of time sometimes to find the words to explain themselves, but we're able to capture those data and use them in our study. And also we achieve greater numbers. So that allowed us to, in this context, achieve greater scale. And we're working on a methodological paper which will hopefully extend the reach of this method to other projects and other settings. I'm now going to hand over to my colleague Jill, who's going to talk about governance.
Hello everybody, my name is Dr. Jill Robbie and I'm a lecturer in private law here at the University of Glasgow. I will be talking about the governance theme in the presentation today. So much of the change of people's behaviour and the change in institutional frameworks to achieve greater sustainability requires governance and regulation. But of course, it's a significant task to understand why governance is effective and in what ways governance can help this transition to sustainability. So academic lawyers, often working with other disciplines in the social sciences, can help build an understanding of what is effective governance at different scales and how existing regulatory frameworks can be improved in order to assist this transition to sustainability. So to demonstrate that point, I want to discuss a project that was undertaken at the School of Law by my colleagues, Professor Irene Marie Esser, Professor Ian McNeill, and Dr. Katarzyna Ladna. So this research was carried out into the non-financial reporting of companies, FTSE 100 companies. I think we can recognise now that companies have a significant impact not only on economy, but also on the environment and on the communities in which they operate, particularly with regard to issues of sustainability. So large-scale companies in particular have a significant role in relation to sustainability matters. Under the Companies Act 2006, directors of large companies have to produce a strategic report every year for the company, and this report includes non-financial information such as environmental, employee, social and human rights issues. The reason behind this reporting is to encourage a more responsible and sustainable approach to business. So the function of non-financial disclosure is then to allow the company's shareholders and indirectly other stakeholders to make informed investment and engagement decisions by providing information on the company's social and environmental risks and impacts. So what this team carried out research into the implications of the production of these reports, the strategic reports for stakeholders such as trade unions, consumer bodies, and environmental organisations. The team first looked at the level of compliance with non-financial reporting requirements, and then they evaluated how this regulatory framework actually helps to inform stakeholders in order to allow them to participate in corporate decision making. When looking at compliance, the team found that compliance with strategic reporting requirements was actually very high, so amounting to super or even over compliance, and that companies are producing a large amount of non-financial information in their reports. The team, though, then went on to look at how stakeholders viewed this information through conducting interviews. And they were interested in whether the strategic reporting provides stakeholders with adequate information to facilitate understanding how companies integrate environmental social issues into decision making, and whether this type of strategic reporting was in fact a basis for stakeholder engagement. The interviews found that stakeholders often perceive that statutory compliance does not necessarily result in high quality information or quality reporting. Stakeholders suggested ways to improve the quality of the information through improving accessibility, as the reports were often difficult to navigate and there were often lengthy additional reports. The stakeholders were also suggesting creating more standardized non-financial reporting, which could be, for example, sector specific, making it easy to compare companies within a specific sector. Finally, the stakeholders suggested that strategic reporting could include evidence on how stakeholders have been involved in actual decision making. So this research suggests as a whole that there has been too much of a focus on the quantity and not the quality of the disclosure of the information through strategic reports. What is the benefit of this particular research? It has a number of benefits and uses. Firstly, it's targeted towards helping stakeholders use information produced in strategic reports in order to influence corporate decision making. And again, this is trying to encourage more sustainable outcomes in the corporate world. Secondly, it helps companies and policymakers understand the practical implications of non-financial reporting and provides ways of improving the governance regime. Of course, it doesn't make sense if a huge amount of information is being generated, which is also a wasted time and effort if that information is then not being put to good use. Lastly, it shows companies and investors how non-financial reporting can be used in order to build trust and a good relationship between companies and relevant stakeholders. So this research can be used at multiple different scales. It can be used at the individual company level for thinking about how companies can improve their reporting themselves, but it also provides a way in which the regulatory system as a whole can be reformed in order to improve stakeholder engagement and therefore help with the transition to sustainability. So this was my summary of the governance theme. I will now pass on to Mia.
Thank you, Jill. So as I said, my name is Mia Perry. I'm based in the School of Education in the College of Social Science at the University of Glasgow. And my work focuses largely on literacies, literacies as ways of making meaning and communicating in the world with texts, but also all sorts of other materials and experiences and methods of engagement. I look at literacies specifically in relation to arts and cultural practices and also in relation to sustainability. So the slide that I bring is are a series of examples of sustainability related practice and research and activism that takes place in the context of our school. But it was worthwhile beginning with just a recognition of this term of education. In the introduction, I initially talked about literacies. And literacies is a contested term because we associate literacies with reading and writing print text, which of course isn't the only way we make meaning with the world. But similarly, education is often assumed or equated with learning. But education, of course, falls into a system and a system of governance, just connecting back to some of the other areas that we have already spoken through today. So I want to preface these examples with a recognition that education is a really broad field and doesn't equate to learning, but equates to the various different structures and systems that we have at our disposal to incorporate and embed new knowledge in engagement with populations. And this includes primary and secondary school compulsory education, which I'll speak briefly about, but also community and informal education, also public pedagogies, so the education that we encounter via museums or political platforms or public spaces. And finally, I'll mention briefly about adult and higher education, which takes place in institutions like ours, as well as vocational and college and further education contexts. So the first example that I just thought I wanted to highlight today is called Walk the Global Walk, and the first bullet point on the slide. And I've said in my slide, young people in sustainability action, and this is a program that takes place in compulsory context of schooling, in primary and secondary schooling. It's led in our context by Dr. Ines Alves and Dr. Ria Dunkley, but it's part of a collective of similar parallel initiatives that are happening in various places across the globe. The interesting role of this project is not only that it localizes sustainable development goals, so taking what have become universalized international issues and looking at how they materialize, what they mean in our local contexts. So there's an educational element in that, but also mobilizing young people as catalysts in local and global movements of sustainability. So the project provokes or asks what happens when the local is put in connection with the global. What happens to sustainable development issues and goals when we think about our neighborhood, but in relation to global context, international contexts. But also what's very interesting about this project in relation to us being in a higher education institution is we look at necessarily activism in relation to research, and activism and research in relation to education. And these things aren't necessarily friendly or natural bedfellows. There are quite contested differences between the work of an activist and the work of a researcher, and certainly the work of a teacher employed by a council. So Walk the Global Walk is an ongoing project in Glasgow. Glasgow is one of many cohorts of young people who are engaged in this work, looking at the Sustainable Development Goals, and raises lots of questions about the possibility of putting research in relation to young people in education and activism in relation to sustainability. The second example is based on the Sustainable Futures in Africa network that I co-direct with a colleague in Africa, in Eswatini. And so I'm using this example to talk about education as it happens in communities, in formal and public places. The network is focused on socio-ecological sustainability and focused on what we can do, what we can manage, what we can accomplish when we look at communities of practice in relation to interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary academic spaces in relation to the non-academic sectors, governmental and non-governmental organizations and development workers. And finally, in relation to cultural practitioners and artists. We work across 5 African countries as well as the UK, and through these cross-sector, cross-culture and cross-disciplinary collaborations, we look at understanding, research and practice in socio-ecological sustainability across Africa and Europe. This network has been in existence for over 4 years now, and it entails multiple distinct research projects. But I just wanted to raise a couple of points that are common across the network that create a common space for us all to engage in. And one of them is that we come together, researchers and practitioners in this network, with a recognition that sustainability and development work in relation to sustainability is not unidirectional. It's not a case of people like me sitting in the global north in Scotland in an office thinking that the problem exists somewhere else and that it's my job to collaborate and contribute to a solution, but actually acknowledging that we're all part of the problem. And indeed, the Global North colleagues that make up the Scottish hub of this network, we probably have more responsibility over some of the sustainability problems than our colleagues in the African countries that we work with. So we come together with a recognition that we're all part of the problem, that we're not looking somewhere else at the problem. And that comes down to our everyday practices as well as our governance systems, our consumer preferences, our travel frameworks, and so on and so on. And the other finding of many things that has come up that is relevant to this conversation today is that despite the fact we work across very, very, very different contexts, both geographically as well as culturally, what emerges frequently and consistently in our work is that some of our problems are very much the same, that we share some problems, whether we're working with a community in northern rural Uganda or in the east side of Glasgow or the center of Lagos in Nigeria. We all share some very, very common problems, and they're quite worrying. It's quite worrying to realize that there are problems we share across the world and we have shared for many, many years, and yet we're still trying to battle them. And those problems, for example, are the disconnect between bodies of knowledge, between community knowledges and governance knowledges. The disparity of power relations and the disparity of the capacity for agency to change, depending on whether you're talking about people in power or people in farms or people in artistic practices. So the disconnect between the stakeholders of common problems is something that we all met around. And so the work is very much focused on methodologies of mitigating these gaps and of mitigating these differences to solve socio-ecological problems. And the final example that I'm going to bring today takes place in the context of universities, of higher education. So it is SUEA, which is a long acronym for a project that's looking at how universities are taking part in sustainability leadership in multiple cities across the globe. So understanding the contribution of universities as civic agents, particularly in relation to sustainable solutions to social, environmental, and economic challenges. So back to looking at the relationship between education and research and activism, this project really has asked different universities in very different contexts what their role is or what their potential is to contribute to urban planning, urban city policy, and educational initiatives around sustainability. So why education needs to connect across all these spaces? As I began with, education is a very, very broad field that equips people, whether they're inside or outside of compulsory contexts. And I think that it's really, really important to pay attention to, because learning and literacies happen in the smallest of overlooked places with profound impact. For example, in our consumer choices, just one example, how do we know what the difference is of buying a £5 t-shirt from a high street store versus buying a secondhand t-shirt and adapting it from our local charity shop? These sorts of things aren't necessarily embedded in curriculum at any particular time, but the ability to make these choices comes down to the opportunities we've had for learning. And it's very, very important that we take these opportunities for learning across the context that they're available to make sure that we move together as a holistic society towards a sustainable future, rather than relying too heavily on consumer choices or on governance or on individual behavior. So I'll leave it there for now and pass on to my colleague, John Shi.
Thanks, Mia. Good morning, everyone. My name is John Shi, a senior lecturer from the School of Interdisciplinary Studies. I'm a hydrologist. My research is mainly about water resource and climate change. This is very different with my colleagues presenting today. So today I will focus on the frame of ecology and talking about environmental sustainability at different scales. In 2015, the SDGs was first adopted by the General Assembly of the United Nations, currently driving most development policy globally. It has 17 goals and 169 targets to monitor and track the progress. So next, I would focus on two projects currently taking place in our school. They're involved with the study of science and social science with different scales, from the regional scale to the community scale. For the regional case study, this is an international collaboration project funded by NERC in the UK, ISFC in China, and GST of Japan, leading by my colleague, Professor Fabrice Reynard. The overarching goal of this research is to provide policy-relevant information on the synergies and trade-offs between selected SDGs and targets at the subnational level. The hypothesis is that trade-offs between SDGs and targets at the regional level, subnational level, create inequalities between segments of society when achieving the SDGs at the national level. Therefore, they used China's Yangtze River Basin as a regional level case study to investigate how land use change impact on flood risk, water quality, and ecology, ecosystems, surveys, and SDGs. To achieve this, they developed different land use change scenarios with a wide range of stakeholders. All these scenarios serve as a basis to capture other changes in hydrology, sediment transport, water quality, and ecosystems. The output from this assessment is eventually used in a modified version of the SDG interlinkage tool. So this project is a very good example with interactions of science and social science research, while the role of social science research was dominant to fulfill the SDGs and targets at the regional scale. Next, I will talk about the community scale case study in which I was involved with the colleagues from Lancaster University and the local NGO Ecoswell in Peru. This is a GCRF seed project funded by the Royal Academy of Engineering. The goal of this project is mainly to fulfill SDG 6 to ensure access to water and sanitation for all at the community scale. The study area is pretty much a remote area in Peru, a small town called Lobitos. It's in the arid climate with annual rainfall just about 2 inches. These dry conditions present extensive negative impacts on the local community. So the groundwater extraction seems a workable solution. To explore the possibility, we conducted the geophysical survey to detect the groundwater availability first, and then we also sampled the water quality from local wells. As a part of the GCRF project, we also organized a stakeholders workshop inviting 26 individuals with different backgrounds from the local. When discussing the use of water for domestic purpose, we discovered that the local people, they primarily using water for personal hygiene purpose, as well as washing, cooking, and general cleaning. A common conclusion received from this community, this local community, is the reuse of green water. After using water for personal consumption, it's also used for animal consumption and garden irrigation. In terms of the management of limited water resource, local people, they were not satisfied the public agencies due to a lot of reasons, such as corruption and mistrust. However, it was still widely accepted the public sector should maintain the control of water resource. Then we further asked them how they feel about the involvement private sector. The primary conclusion from the survey is the community, they like the local company to take over, not a national one, because they think the local company will have a higher level of accountability, and the community members, they could involved with the management. And also, in terms of local laws, in Peru, there are 3 laws involved with the protection of water resource, and many locals, they voiced negatively regarding the usefulness of these laws because the corresponding government agencies, they have a hard time, really hard time to regulate. So in the end, of this stakeholder meeting, we also discussed the potential infrastructure issues. From their perspective, a water treatment seems necessary for both the water extracted from consumption as well as water to be disposed. In addition, a better education system would be essential to ensure proper functioning of infrastructures, proper use of clean water, and proper treatment of wastewater. This stakeholder meeting has been incredibly beneficial because our original goal for this workshop was just to introduce our geophysical survey and understand the social and economic impacts of this groundwater project to the local community. However, through the workshop, we were able to find out much more from the community, what they know, they don't know, and also their expectations. The information we gathered from the workshop would be a guideline for the local NGOs, and also this changed our original plan to proceed a full proposal in the same direction. Although this community scale project is geoscience dominant, the reflection from the stakeholder meeting resulted in a need of interdisciplinary team, including social scientists involved with the future project, such as from public health, education, law, and governance to engage, as well as the direct partnership with local communities and agencies on environmental sustainability and water resource management. Thank you. Next, I would hand over to Mia.
Thank you, John. Thank you, everybody. So I will give our panelists an opportunity to respond to questions and make final comments. So I won't have the final word, but I will just maybe wrap up by bringing your attention to the fact that we don't necessarily, when I say we, I mean the world of knowledge, we don't collectively lack knowledges or lack skills or techniques that we need to face a climate emergency or sustainability issues and challenges. We certainly don't lack the urgency to face these and address these, but perhaps what we lack is methods of connectivity across the very different scales and stakeholders of these issues. And I think that all of the examples and the panelists' contributions today raise awareness to 4 areas possibly that need to be better connected. But when we look at social sciences in relation to industry, in relation to community, in relation to government, in relation to other disciplines, I wonder with my colleagues if our main problem is communications and connectivity across these spaces. And hopefully with events such as this one and with your questions and discussion, we might drive ourselves in the right direction and not remain siloed and ever more frantic in the urgency that we face. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I think that you can see our faces again at this point. And we are going to take some questions.
Mia, there's been a question actually about the governance presentation. So the question was whether there has been feedback given to any of the FTSE 100 companies regarding the research, and whether we're seeing changes in how the stakeholders are participating in corporate decision making. So I think in relation to this particular research project, it wasn't aim of the research project to give feedback to the FTSE 100 companies, because the reports are publicly available in a sense, so that's the way that the research was generated. And it was only at one particular moment in time, so the research in itself couldn't track the changes of how researchers are participating in corporate decision making. But if I could suggest how I've been experiencing the trends in relation to stakeholders and a lot and activism in relation to corporate decision making, I think there's been, of course, a lot more public pressure and awareness of the effects of companies and governance regimes on sustainability issues. So we see incredible organizations like Client Earth, which are taking companies to court to try and ensure that they're adhering to governance regimes. That's a very antagonistic way of trying to improve sustainability matters. And what I think this research is trying to enhance is that we actually get to a dialogue where information is provided which is useful, and stakeholders can then engage with companies about how to improve their performance in sustainability issues. So I suppose this research would need to be repeated in order to see if companies, for example, did take the recommendations on board and then did improve that stakeholder dialogue, whether there would be positive results and a greater track record for sustainability issues. But thank you for the question.
Thanks, Jill. So please feel free to add your questions. We're receiving questions in the Q&A box, and it can be anything at all, no such thing as a bad question to spark discussion. And we have a couple of others that we'll respond to. One of the attendees has asked about social impact assessments of green interventions, and if we have case studies or comments on the availability of these things. And I genuinely will ask for my panelists to contribute as well, because my answer is a little bit cynical, and that is to say that you will be able to find social impact assessments of green interventions, for example, around green energy innovations, for example. The problem that we have found, and a lot of the research that I'm involved in addresses this very problem, is that the assessment of a green intervention is the outcome or the impact of a green intervention is very different depending on who you ask. And the majority of what is available are assessments led by the initiators of the intervention. So, for example, in a project that we're involved in geothermal energy in sub-Saharan Africa at the moment, there is lots of assessments to be found. You can find it in both academic and non-academic publications about the benefits of geothermal energy, the environmental benefits, the cost benefits, the development benefits. However, a lot of that assessment isn't holistic and doesn't come from the lived communities, people who actually reside on the land that is being drilled for the access of geothermal energy. So when there are some new emerging examples of much more holistic impact assessments of, for example, geothermal energy, and it's horribly complicated. The impacts can be very, very negative of these so-called sustainable solutions to energy when you consider people who may not ever actually access that greener or less expensive energy, but whose livelihoods will be interrupted because of the purchasing of land around them or the infrastructure, and often the pollution of land around them through the development of the infrastructure. So I hope that there's some more positive responses from the panel, but I have to say at the moment, right back to my point that I ended with, what we lack is a consideration across the very, very different stakeholders and when I say different stakeholders, with such different things to gain or lose out of these interventions. There aren't very many good examples that I can refer to that look at those in relation to one another. So before I move on to another question, I just want to make sure that John and Jill and Jude have an opportunity to counter-respond to that.
Hi, Mia. I want to share something from our GCR project. So during the stakeholder meeting, when we discussed the water use for irrigation with stakeholders, and we were surprised to know, they want to use some water even for maintaining the maintenance of green community space, because in this small town and tourism, surprisingly, because they are very good sport for serving, they still want to make some benefits, some revenues from the tourism. So that's why they want to use some water, even though they are facing water shortage. They still want to use some water for green community space. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, John.
Sure.
Jude or Jill, would you like to add to that, or shall I move on to the next question? Okay. So Jill, the next question is for you. Should I read out the question and then leave it to you to answer?
I'm happy to just summarize the question.
It would be easier for you than me.
Yeah, in my response, so the question is, how robust are the observations from stakeholders that they would like less specific or less and more specific information, and is there a danger that this is more a reaction, that they would like it to be easier to analyze and compare and not a robust view as to whether the more specific information would actually be valuable? So what I think that this is a really interesting question, because having been a practicing lawyer, I can sympathize with company reports which are produced, which of course from the company's perspective are the highest quality, most specific and most attentive reports that they can produce in the circumstances. And it can be very time consuming in order to produce these reports, which are regulatory requirements. So I think that that's shown in the research in the sense that there's this super and over compliance. So the companies are trying to do the best that they can, but almost linking this to Mia's presentation, there is then this gap between the information that is produced and how the stakeholders can use this information and then feed back into the process. So I think that that's what the value of the research is here, and also including companies within that loop, in the sense of it has to be a two-way dialogue that goes on as to how can we produce the most relevant and high quality information that we can, which is also useful to the people whose lives and environments will be affected by this information and by the practices by companies. So I think sometimes when I was a practicing lawyer, it was always when there was a new regulation that came in, we had to learn this immediately and then produce new documentation which is to a new and difficult standard, and we would do that to the best of our ability. But I suppose in order to benefit us all from having a more sustainable culture and sustainable economy, there will have to be a kind of iterative process to understand how exactly we do that. So I think that this just shows the processes that we perhaps need to go through in order to ensure that the information provided is as useful as possible. But I entirely take the point which is said in that question.
Thanks, Jill. I think we have a time for another question. So there is a question about the relationship between health practice and research in relation to educational research and practice, governance, and these may be three different questions, and environmental sustainability. Jude, do you see that play out in the field of public health, these very explicit connections between the fields that we've brought together today, or not? Oh, and you're muted still.
Not sure if yes. Yes, I think there are interconnections. I think what we are trying to do as a group here at Glasgow, but also more generally, I think across the academic sector, is try and, as you say, break down the silos of practice So one of the difficulties is talking about health is, if you like, the health imperative. You know, we must save lives. There is clearly a particular goal at the end of it in terms of cure or making a condition manageable, or in terms of extending life chances for people, but they cannot be at the expense of other issues. And I think there's an increasing realization that whatever the practice is, it has to be sustainable in the longer term. And the other, just to say as well, the other big issue for health is around inequalities. So while significant advances in terms of technology or pharma or whatever the solution is, it can make amazing differences to some people's lives, but it may be beyond the hope or aspiration even of people, the majority of people living elsewhere in the world. And so increasingly health equity has had to take account of all these other fields. You know, if people can't get clean water, then how do they access even quite simple formula for healthcare if people cannot living in a society where laws, basic laws, are not being obeyed, perhaps their minerals are being extracted or their resources are being alienated from them. And of course, if they don't have the literacies to be able to make the sorts of informed choices that we would hope people would make, then unfortunately the best healthcare practice and best aspirations of people working in health are going to be negated.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Okay, let's try to take one more question. So we have a question in around universities and the university's role as a beacon of society, regarded as institutions with significant responsibilities to help resolve issues of sustainability, as well as serve as role models by implementing sustainable plans. The questioner suggests that there are so many indicators already to measure ecological footprint, such as energy consumption, food consumption, waste disposal, water supply, transportation, paper consumption. Should we be taking a closer look at home, and are universities doing enough? So I love the proposition or the provocation. I love the question. And I think that we could actually replace the word universities with all sorts of institutions around us, especially in the global north. Are we doing enough? And so my answer is no, I don't think universities are doing enough. But I think it suggests a bigger issue, which is, as I said earlier, we know we have a lot of information. We have a lot of multidisciplinary information, science and knowledge and skills and expertise and data around the urgency of the environmental crisis. But what we don't have is change, and change in our institutional structures and change in our practice. So I think the short answer is we're not doing enough. But the complexity of that actually relates to what Jude was just saying. People are in very, very different positions and have very different levels of agency to do anything different. And it's really the responsibility, from my perspective, of people with power, people in leadership positions, people with autonomy, but also people who aren't dealing with primary needs, to really enable a broader society to make more sustainable changes and choices. And universities, yes, are the very place where that should be being modelled and happening. At the University of Glasgow, we are trying. Our research theme in the College of Social Sciences is a really important space, but we're working with other initiatives across the university to try and bring together a faster and a more visible momentum for sustainability. But we, like all large institutions and other universities across the world, probably, we have some big challenges in front of us to do with other priorities, other considerations. For example, the seeming need to continually develop and grow, and I think that's right at the heart of our issue. And I don't want to speak out of turn, out of line around the University of Glasgow. I think we share it as a higher education sector. This idea that our development and our growth has to equate to larger numbers and bigger outputs, for example, is not necessarily an easy battle when we're looking at university being a model of sustainability. We may have to rethink the frameworks, as you hear, many of you are already familiar with frameworks and discourses of degrowth in other sectors. We have to broach that in the university sector as well, I believe. And again, John, Jill, Jude, you may have other things to add to that. Okay. Okay, well, I have got a few final closing comments, so I'm going to close the questions now. So my first comment is to thank everybody today for joining today's session. I am told it was the first of the series of events running across September and October, so we hope that we have set the bar and put it off to a good start. We hope that you found the session enjoyable and insightful. It's certainly been a great platform for us and a purpose to bring our work together in this way. We hope that you'll be able to join other sessions within the Aspect annual event series. And also we would value your feedback. So once the session has ended, you'll individually be directed to a very short survey. I'm assured it will take just 1 minute to complete and for you to let us know what you think. And a way to give us any sort of feedback to keep in touch. It's one of the limitations of this digital mode is that we won't necessarily get feedback otherwise. The recording of this session will go live in the coming days and we'll let you know once it's available to view. And with that, many thanks again to the panelists and to all of you who've attended and participated today, and goodbye.